A Child's History of the World, Chapter 72, Red Cap and Red Heels. The last Louis, the first that we learned about, was the Louis who went on the last crusade. Now we're going to talk about two kings named Louis who were not saints. They were Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th, and they ruled France while the Stuarts were reigning in the 17th century in England. If you look at this right here, the X means 10, and then each of these lines means 1. This is called Roman numeral writing. So that's how I got Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th. The IV means 4. So Louis the 13th and 14th ruled France while the Stuarts were reigning in the 17th century in England. So the Stuarts that we just talked about. Louis the 13th was king in name only. Another man told him what to do, and he did it. Strange to say, this other man was a great ruler of the church called a cardinal, and he wore a red cap and gown. The cardinal's name was Richelieu. During the reign of Louis the 13th, another long war started. It lasted 30 years and was called the 30 Years' War. It was different from most wars. It was not a war of one country against another, but it was a war of religions, so two religions fighting each other. It was the Protestants and the Catholics. Cardinal Richelieu was, of course, a Catholic, and he was the real ruler of France, which was a Catholic country. Nevertheless, he took sides with the Protestants, for they were fighting a Catholic country called Austria, and he wanted to beat Austria. Most of the countries in Europe took part in this war, but Germany was the battleground where most of the fighting was done. Even Sweden, a northern country of Europe, which we have not talked about before, took part. The king of Sweden at this time was named Gustavus Adolphus, and he was called the Snow King because he was king of such a cold country, and also the Lion of the North, for he was such a brave fighter. He was the finest in character of all the kings and rulers in Europe at this time. Most of the rulers thought only of themselves, and they would lie and cheat and steal and even murder to get what they wanted. But Gustavus Adolphus was fighting for what he thought was right. Gustavus Adolphus was a Protestant, and so he came down into Germany and fought on the side of the Protestants. He was a great general, and his army won. Unfortunately, he himself was killed in battle. The Protestants came out ahead in the 30 Years' War, and at last a famous treaty of peace was made called the Treaty of Westphalia. By this treaty, and a treaty means an agreement between two people or two countries, it was agreed that each country should have whatever religion its ruler had. It could be Protestant or Catholic as the ruler wished. During the 30 Years' War, the plague, that old deadly contagious disease that we talked about, it broke out in Europe, if you remember, in England, broke out in Germany. A little town named Oberammergau prayed that it might be spared. The townspeople vowed that if they were spared, they would give a play of Christ's life once every 10 years. They were spared, so the plague did not come to their town. And so every 10 years, ever since then, with only a few exceptions, they have been giving what is called the Passion Play. Tens of thousands of tourists from all over the world travel to this little out-of-the-way town to see the townspeople act the story of Christ's life. The play is given on Sundays during the summer of the 10th year, and it lasts all day long. About 700 people take part. It is a great honor to be chosen to play the part of the saint, and it is the highest honor to be selected to play the part of Christ. The next French king to rule after Louis the 13th and Richelieu was Louis the 14th. The people in England had at last succeeded in getting the power to rule themselves through their parliament, but in France, Louis would let no one rule but himself. He said, "I am the state," and he would let no one have a say in the government. This was the same of the Stuarts' divine right of kings that the English people had put a stop to. Louis ruled for more than 70 years. This is the longest time that anyone in history has ever ruled. Louis XIV was called the Grand Monarch, and everything he did was to show off. He was always parading and strutting about as if he were the leading character in a play and not just an ordinary human being. He wore corsets and a huge powdered wig and shoes with very high red heels to make himself look taller. He carried a long cane, stuck out his elbows, turned out his toes, and strutted up and down, for he thought these things made him seem grand and important. All this may sound as if Louis were a strange person with no sense, but he wasn't. In spite of his absurd manners, he made France the chief power in Europe. He was almost constantly fighting other countries, trying to increase the size of France and to add to his kingdom. So France had her turn as leader of all the other countries, just as Spain and England had had theirs. Louis built a magnificent palace at Versailles, in which were marble halls, beautiful paintings, and many huge mirrors, so he could see himself. The palace was surrounded by a park with wonderful fountains. The water for the fountains had to be brought a long distance, and it cost thousands of dollars to have the fountains play just for a few minutes. Even today, sightseers visit Versailles to see the magnificent palace rooms and to watch the fountains play. But Louis surrounded himself not only with beautiful things. He surrounded himself with all the most interesting men and women of all time. All those who could do anything exceptionally well, like paint or write or talk or play or look well, he brought together to live with him or nearby him, and he called them his court. They were the chosen few who looked down on all the others. This was all very fine for the people who were lucky enough to be in Louis's court, but the poor people of France, ordinary farmers and the men and women who worked in the towns, were the ones who had to pay Louis's expenses and those of his court. They had to pay for his parties and balls and feasts and for all sorts of presents that he gave his friends. I wonder how they felt about that. The book says we'll soon see what happened because they got tired of paying for Louis's fun. The poor people would not stand that sort of thing forever.